بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا وقوتنا محمد عليه أفضل الصلاة وأزكى التسليم اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما يا رب العالمين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. It's an honor to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me to the esteemed city of Cambridge and this educational institution. I don't ever repeat talks, so what you're getting is completely fresh and new, though it does build on a lot of the work that some of you might have seen before. But especially with folks at university level, I like to bring you along to the front edge or the cutting edge of my thinking with hopes that you can contribute what you have to offer. So that being said, I think we have a QR code that will be displayed at some point. So some of the stuff that we're going to go through, if you have clarifying questions, it means like you don't understand anything, then just put your hand up and I'll answer them right away, because some of the things are going to require you to follow along. If you have like tangents or ideas or illustrations or other sorts of questions that aren't one of clarifying the understanding, then refer it to the QR code. I personally like to make sure that we don't leave until all questions are answered. So, and as a convert to Islam, there's no such thing as an out-of-bounds question. If it's a stupid one, I'll tell you so, but all questions are welcome. So I was given a somewhat interesting and also important question, which is, oh, by the way, who am I talking to? Raise your hand if you're a STEM major. All right, raise your hand if you're not a STEM major. Okay, what are some of the that's like 50-50. Okay, what are some folks in the humanities, what are we studying?
I have a bachelor's in law and I'm making master in business administration.
Okay, very nice. Any others? Yes?
English literature.
Nice, very good. Okay. Anyone in poli-sci? Okay, had a couple. Sociology, that's our little cousin. Yes? Theology. All right. Very good. Anybody in education? Astaghfirullah. Who's going to teach the next generation? We have no one in education. Who's going to make the curriculum? All right. Anyway, okay, very good. So, I was asked to speak about reimagining governance, lessons from Islamic history. I'm going to under-deliver on the lessons from Islamic history because I am not a historian. Though I did start out as a history major, I quickly switched to political science and international relations and political theory when I saw the discipline or the structure of the discipline of history, which is a little bit lacking self-awareness as to its metaphysical underpinnings. Many of you know that I've done a bit of work on Halak. Wa'il Halak, he's a Palestinian thinker. He's a professor at Columbia University in New York City. I'm starting with him, so I'm going to catch you up very quickly on Halak's main contribution to a larger conversation which has to do with statehood and Islamic governance. What's the relationship between statehood or various political configurations, various political technologies, and Islamic law? So Halak wrote a book that was very controversial that was called The Impossible State. The Impossible State's main thesis was that the nation state is inherently contradictory to Islamic governance. And the reason why that is so is because the nation state amalgamates power in new and, particularly thick ways and intense ways that no other political configuration had done so prior to. And that was inimical, according to Halak, to the structure that is called for in the Sharia, where the ultimate sovereignty is with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the Sharia itself. In the nation-state model, the ultimate sovereignty is with the state. There is no law higher than the state's law. So that was his main thesis, and that's why he named his book The Impossible State. It was kind of like a trigger. It was like a thumbnail that was like clickbait. A lot of people, found it maybe even a misnomer. He was not saying that it's not possible to have Islamic governance. Rather, he was trying to arrive at a place where we could talk about what Islamic governance would look like. It was simply his contention that it's not going to happen through the nation state, that the nation state is set up inherently in a way that will squeak out, squash, suffocate any truly Islamic system. And he went on to clarify some of the doubts or some of the responses in his next book, which was called Restating Orientalism, which is a fantastic book, one of my favorite books. If you like Foucault and you like to hurt yourself, then I recommend that you try to read it. But Halak has a side comment, which has not really been talked about, that I think requires further elaboration and theorization on. And that is something that Halak says about democracy, and it's very relevant to the topic here tonight. Halak makes a claim, almost in passing, through the elaboration of his thesis, that an actual Islamic governance is more democratic than the actual democracies that we have today. It's a somewhat controversial claim, because if you go onto the street or in your average masjid, especially some of the masjids in London, it's a little rough down there, they're going to say democracy is shirk, right? Democracy is kufr. How could you possibly think that democracy is anything good, you kafir murtad, right? Halak's saying the exact opposite. He says, no, it's not necessarily that. What it rather is that what democracy is, if you squint, or if we redefine it, or if we elaborate what is the maqsad, what is the intent of democracy, is better served by Islamic governance than by the constitutional republican or representative democracies that we have today. That opens up a can of worms that I haven't really seen many people explore. And so this is going to be a bit of a journey to attempt to engage in that thread and to unpack it a little bit. What are the implications of it? And what does it draw to mind from the bare bones or the skeleton of Islamic history, especially the formative periods, because we care a little bit more about the formative period as normative practicing Muslims, which the vast majority of us in this room are. In order to have that conversation, we have to interrogate what is democracy in the first place. Is democracy just about voting? Is democracy just about majoritarian rule? Is democracy about representation? Is democracy about sovereignty? If we go to the linguistic meaning of the word, it's a little bit cryptic. It's supposed to be the rule by the people. But how is rule by the people achieved? That is what Halak is implicitly arguing for. What Halak is implicitly saying, and sometimes explicitly, is that rule by the people, in some understanding of that phrase, is better served by Islamic governance than it is by the constitutional representative democracies that we have today. That seems a little controversial and perhaps surprising. But I think that we've reached a place in 2024 where we can at least say that the forms, right, and the technologies that modern democracies have been practicing and have institutionalized in order to serve the purpose of rule by the people have largely failed. I think that that's a pretty fair assessment that many of us could probably agree to. And what I mean by that is that if you look at certain groups and how they have, let's say, captured institutions and captured law, and they have infiltrated and essentially used the systems of law and politics and the media apparatus or otherwise in societies like the UK and the US, then we have to question, do these societies actually achieve the ultimate goal of democracy, which is rule by the people? Are the people actually ruling? We have voting, we have majority rule, we have representatives, we have a constitution, we have supposedly the sovereignty of the nation, amorphously defined, but do we actually have rule by the people? Have special interest groups, elite interests, been able to use the technologies and the institutions that have been set up in its current configuration in order to undermine and subvert the will of the people or what the people want? I don't know about you all in the UK, but certainly in the US context, that is absolutely true. That is absolutely true. Voter turnout is so low that it usually hovers around a quarter, especially in the off-year elections or the non-general elections. People are disengaged from civic engagement or from voting or from civil society. I know this is part of a week where we were hoping to talk about the intersection of being engaged and making institutions. And that is something that is undermined sometimes in democracies such as the United States, where the average person on the street gets the feeling that the elite crooks are just kind of running everything and playing the system. This was brought into stark relief by Luigi Mangione, my fellow Italian brother, who gunned down one of the insurance company CEOs in broad day, actually, early morning hours in New York City, which, as much as the mainstream media tried to turn the targets against him, they were surprised and even had to acknowledge that the majority of America sympathized with him. So this is something of a flashpoint. We see that many of the systems, governance, social services, otherwise, they're not working the way that perhaps they were intended, or at least hoped that they would work. And so this is pertinent to our conversation and to our inquiry, that do we really have democracy in a meaningful sense? Even though if we have the forms, do we have the substance? Have we achieved its aims? Even if we have some of the technologies and practices of what we would think are democracies, is it actually working the way it is intended? My contention is that it is not. So, if we have that, and we can at least agree to the possibility of that, let's flip that equation on the inverse and say, is it possible to have the substance of democracy, which I'm putting forth is rule by the people, without the forms that are usually used to diagnose and recognize a democracy, without formal representation, without formal voting or majoritarian rule, or without full sovereignty given to the amorphously defined nation? Is it possible, if we can have a situation in which we have the form but not the substance, is it possible to have the substance without the form? That is an inquiry that I think needs to be explored, and it's one that is pertinent to the discussion of halak and the idea of Islamic governance being better serving the substance of democracy and what it's all about. Now, again, if we go back to some of the mosques in London, they'd be pulling their hair out at this point, because we're talking about democracy in a non-ideological way. We're opening ourselves to all sorts of possibilities here that are somewhat uncomfortable, maybe different from the way that we're used to thinking about them. I want to run through some of those markers, what are usually used as diagnosing whether a society is a democracy or not, and demonstrate the overlap, because sometimes we get trapped into absolutist thinking, where we are posed a question, almost like do you condemn question, where it is like, is democracy Islamic or not? And the answer is either yes or no. Whereas maybe the answer could be 70% or 60% or sort of, or if this condition is satisfied. There are many possibilities and permutations for a bit of nuance. So I want to go through these markers, and I want to explain potential parallels. I'm not extremely 100% confident on all of this, and I could stand to be corrected. But potential parallels and analogs that exist either in the Sharia or in the formative period of Islamic history, and how they align and how they depart a little bit. And the whole purpose of doing this is to try to decouple and disaggregate things that are already aggregated within the Western form of what we think of as democracies. Is it possible to scramble these categories? Is it possible to rearrange things and to put the pieces back together in a different way that is both Islam and democracy? That's sort of an interesting thing that I hope we can explore together. Everybody cool? Everybody with me? All right. So the first is voting. I have a blog piece that I've written on this for Yaqeen Institute. I also had an episode with Paul Williams in Blogging Theology, who I keep missing, by the way. I've been to the UK twice and I have not met the man. And when I'm in London, he's in Cambridge, and then when I come to Cambridge, he's in London, and then we keep crisscrossing each other. But may Allah preserve him. He's a brilliant person, and I have a lot of respect for him. So there's a video that goes into further depth on the status of voting in Islamic fiqh, especially based off of one of the book by one of the surprisingly Saudi ulama, Fahd Saleh Ajlan, who has a book, Al-Intikhabat fil Fiqh al-Islami, which is a very, very good book in which he runs down many of the scenarios. So I'm not going to go full into that conversation, but if you want more information, you can see those resources. We do have parallels in the Sharia and in the formative period of Islam that seem to resemble something like voting. Recall that after the Prophet ﷺ passed away, the way in which the different khulafa, the commanders of the believers, or however you want to translate that, are appointed varies. Abu Bakr was nominated by unanimous committee. Abu Bakr appoints Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhu without any input from anybody else. And then Umar ibn al-Khattab, when he is stabbed, he is lying on his deathbed and he appoints a council. And the logic of that council, and that's a council of the senior companions, is that they are going to vote amongst them to decide who is the next Khalifa. So we have here a straight vote, and it is a straight majoritarian vote as well. So if we bump down from voting to majority rule, that also goes to indicate a potential precedence or a potential analog that we have. Now, if we drill down on one of the details of how that vote took place, we get an even more interesting detail, and perhaps a more applicable one, which is the tie-breaking vote, which came down to Abdurrahman ibn Auf. He was undecided, and what he chose to do looks a lot like representative democracy, in that he went around the streets of Medina and he asked the people, and some of the narrations report that he asked the women and children as well, so it wasn't even just limited to the Greek conception of democracy. He went and asked everybody, the inhabitants of Medina, who they favored, whether they favored Uthman or Ali. And then he comes back and reports that he found the majority of people favoring Uthman, and so that was his tie-breaking vote. We also see the Prophet ﷺ, do we have children here? MashaAllah, Assalamu alaikum. I strongly support the inclusion of young children in university spaces. One of the most unnatural things is to gather people according to their age group. And so you only have 18 to 23-year-olds in the same place. We have to have, oh, MashaAllah, Assalamu alaikum. Who do we have here? MashaAllah. No, don't be sorry. No, we appreciate your presence, both of you. Yeah, one of the most unnatural things is to gather simply people of the same age and lock them away from society and tell them that they should produce social theory, right? Normally the most, I think, natural thing is to embed people with multiple generations to benefit from the young, to benefit from the old. So I'm very much an advocate of that. Okay, so we have something that looks like majority rule. We also have examples of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ during his time appealing to the majority, or at least inquiring into what is the will of the majority. If you see how he approached ﷺ the Battle of Badr, when he is there with a raiding force or a raiding party that comes in contact with an entire army, and he is basically taking their temperature, seeing what their opinions are, seeing what they want to do, and he deferred to what everyone wanted to do, or at least the vast majority, which was to engage the enemy. If you saw at the Battle of Uhud, he did a similar thing where he himself, ﷺ, had a dream that indicated that the better strategy would be to stay inside of the city of Medina and fight and engage the enemy there. And yet, the majority of his companions wanted something different. A mix of the hypocrites who were just trying to, grandstand, and the companions who had missed out on the Battle of Badr, who decided that they wanted to march out and meet the enemy in a more dramatic and traditional sense. So we see the Prophet ﷺ engaging in the majority, or having some reference, and we can dispute perhaps the degree of deference to that majority, but we see that there's some sort of precedent and some sort of analog there. And then we have the many ahadith where the Prophet ﷺ talked about the jama'ah, the mass body of Muslims, and how there is guidance and there is safety and there's a certain gravity in the jama'ah, that the jama'ah, the great mass of Muslims, provides sort of a safeguard for maybe a fringe esotericism or other things that might happen politically, theologically, otherwise, that are not really supported by the deen. That's like a populist streak, or something that perhaps is akin to a populist streak in how Islam is set up, that the jama'ah has some sort of authority, and even more so if we go to ijma', which is a consensus. We've talked about representation with the story of Abdurrahman bin Auf. Now sovereignty, my argument or my preliminary thought is that of all of these elements, that sovereignty is really the one that is most different. That we can find analogs that can, I think, parallel things like voting or the technology of voting or majority rule or representation. By the way, Sheikh Fahd Saleh Ajlan's book goes into the rulings and the different statements of the ulama on using those technologies within a Sharia system. It's quite interesting. But sovereignty is really the rub, and that is going back to Halak's point, that maybe the difference or the biggest difference between what we understand readily as modern constitutional democracies and a Sharia system or a system of Islamic governance is the location of sovereignty. And certainly that is the crux of Halak's argument, that the idea of the nation state locates, which is, is tied to how we think about modern democracies, puts the location of sovereignty in the nation. That is the people themselves. And it is supposedly an unqualified sovereignty. Supposedly they give up some of their rights to the government in order for the protection, security, and the services that the government provides. Whether you believe that story, I don't really, but that's the Lockean sort of legitimizing discourse. The idea still is that the sovereignty belongs to a nation, even if it's just discursively and not actually the material reality. The idea is that the sovereignty belongs to the nation, and the nation is the really only issue or only location of sovereignty. That's a big difference from Islam, which puts Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as the ultimate sovereign, and any other sovereignty that exists is derivative and secondary to His sovereignty. So Allah expresses His will, His sovereign will, through the Sharia. Yes, the Sharia is interpreted by a class of scholars called the ulama. Yes, there is derivative authority in things like the jama'ah and things like ijma', and even things like the bay'ah, things like the Pledge of Allegiance, and the recognition of the community of a particular leader. But certainly we would say that the amount of sovereignty that is located within the ummah itself is less intense and more conditional and more derivative than the sovereignty that supposedly exists in the nation. Okay, so let's get to Halak's argument that Islamic governance is more democratic than the democracies that we see today. If you've read Halak, you understand that he goes through, part of his construction of this argument is through his claim that the Sharia produces a very localist network and web of scholars of different types that have an interface with the people, and that interface between the interpretation and application of the Sharia and the people is where the rule of the people happens, the back and forth at that interface. So he specifically talks about different figures within the Sharia that indicate this, or different tasks, such as the Qadi. So the Qadi is the judge, and he talks about the difference between modern law and Islamic law, and he talks about the difference between Western court systems and Islamic court systems, and how Islamic court systems are meant to be much more egalitarian. They're meant to be much more equal access. You're not supposed to fear getting sued or fear having to sue somebody. You're supposed to be able to approach the Qadi with a very low barrier of entry. Besides the financial costs of legal fees, also the language through which arguments are made in the system are supposed to be access or freely accessible to everybody. They are the common language of the Sharia, which has an element of public reason to it, as opposed to, God help you if you have to read like a lawyer's document and understand a contract. It is written in legalese intentionally so that it creates a separate class of lawyers that require a separate training, that it's a gatekeeping mechanism, so that nobody can take the law into their own hands or really represent themselves, at least very successfully. So that is an important aspect that Halak refers to in trying to demonstrate which of these two systems shows a greater rule by the people. A system in which litigation can happen in a context that is open to all and accessible to all, or at least more so than the system that we currently have today, where it is an extremely specialized area that requires a fair bit of resources, certainly a lot of time, in order to engage in. The second character of the Islamic law that Halak talks about and that we'll mention here is the mufti. Of course, the mufti is the one who is giving non-binding religious opinions on individual or local cases. So what's the ruling about vaping? What's the ruling about or edibles, or every single new thing that's coming down the pipeline? Now, Halak argues that the mufti is one of the most important aspects of the mufti is that he is locally embedded in the neighborhoods and the place where he resides. So he has an understanding of custom. I should take another sip of this coffee. He has an understanding of the local custom which plays into his iftat and how the body of iftat and these types of legal verdicts are arrived at. He is largely autonomous, which is another extremely important thing that I forgot to mention about the judge as well. Autonomous in the sense that he is recognized by the mass of the people. It's almost as if the people recognize the quality of the scholar, which seems counterintuitive because you would say, well, how could the masses really verify whether a scholar was qualified or not? Well, they couldn't necessarily, but the twin way of having an ijazah system where people are individually getting credentials from other senior scholars and licenses to teach, with also something of a populist system of recognition that the people are following Abu Hanifa and the people are following Imam Malik and they're following Shafi'i and Imam Ahmed, that they are recognizable as the masters in their field. That is something that also is a vector of rule by the people. Now imagine if, let's try to think of a modern application of that. Imagine if MPs, okay, I'll give an American example because we like to make fun of Americans, right? We can beat down on the Americans. Some of the people in the Congress are idiots. They are some of the most ignorant people that you've ever met. And I'm sure with social media you've seen some examples of that. So imagine if there was something of a system that the vote isn't doing it, apparently, but imagine if there was a system of recognition where people were recognized as top of their field or elites in their field based off of public or popular recognition of a certain type of prowess or effectiveness. We could argue that there could be workarounds for that, or that could go awry very quickly. That's possible. But again, we're just trying to compare two ways of doing things. That there is a vector through the mufti and the recognition of the skill of the mufti that is popular, that doesn't really have, I don't think, an analog in modern democracies, and it gets you to think, again, by what mechanisms are we achieving a democratic society which supposedly is ruled by the people. Now that's just one way in which they are autonomous. The other way is the structure of education. This is one of Halak's hobby horses, where he talks about how one of the nation states' major interventions, and this goes along the Foucauldian difference between sovereign and disciplinary power, is the Ministry of Education, right? The centralization of education and curriculums and the stranglehold of controlling what people learn, and that whole process of being or transformation and subject formation that comes about from that. Right? Halak's argument is that before the modern era, and certainly in the early formative period of the Sharia, that the religious education was something that was also localized and autonomous, that they were structured and funded by religious endowments or charitable endowments that did not have a whole bunch of say, practically speaking, in what was being taught. And so that there was an atmosphere and a structure of very, very autonomous learning that was going on that allowed a certain meritocracy to take place where the best and brightest were allowed to rise to the top, at least in theory. The third type of person within this system is the faqih. And the faqih is the person who interprets the law. They're the people that write the books. They're the people that teach the fiqh in the halaqat or later in the universities. We have many of the similar characteristics as the previous two, such as supposedly the autonomous education, the knowledge production that is supposedly outside of the grasp of the centralized state, or at least the state is not yet centralized enough in order to have full mastery and control over the production of knowledge, and that these things are funded by the waqf. So, in summary, one of Halak's main arguments is that the role of the sultan or the central government is much weaker than compared to modern democracies, where the governments, they have their fingers very, very deep in everything. The level of penetration and control is much more. Why this is relevant to this topic is because, again, we are trying to assess by what means is rule of the people actually achieved? If you have a centralized government, such as the nation state, even if it has the trappings of democracy, it has voting, it has majority rule, it has representation, it has sovereignty, it has a constitution. However, it also has a nation state that has a modus operandi of itself. It has extreme penetration and control of media, of thought, of knowledge production, education, all of these things. What avenues and vectors are there for the people to actually rule? Have we reached a situation where the forms of rule by the people have been, we can tick them off, but the substance has been lost or subverted in any other way? And the inverse or the converse or the implication of that, is it possible that an Islamic system of governance, excuse me, is it possible that an Islamic system of governance actually provides a better method of rule by the people than the so-called democracies today, where there is an interface locally, there is this sort of back and forth recognition of expertise, and everything else that we've mentioned. Now, getting to the last major topic, okay, what else is there within, so I just basically summarized halak for you. It saved you a bunch of time and a lot of acrimony. What else is there in the Sharia from other parts of my training that might bolster this argument or complicate it or further it or generate some interesting discussion? There's an interesting feature, I think, in Islamic governance, which is the organic innovation of systems, institutions, and disciplines. And I think if we look at this from a very, very high level, we'll see that my argument, I'll throw my thesis out there in front, is that there is more structural potential for change and dynamism in Islamic governance than there seems to be in democracies, or what we recognize as modern democracies. That Islamic governance, and even the Islamic society, which included not just the governance, but the production of knowledge, the training of scholars, the training of students, seems to have mechanisms that accommodate flexibility and change and accountability in really interesting and unique ways that haven't, to my knowledge, and people here might know better than me, that haven't necessarily been optimized or explored. One of the fundamental aspects of the Sharia that is crucial to the entire conversation is that the Sharia is rational. That we know that the Sharia is rational. And this is the aqidah of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, that af'alullah mu'allalah, that there is ta'leel, there is illah behind the things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does, whether we know it or not. Now that's a separate question of whether we have epistemological access to those ilal, to those reasons or rationale, but we have it on faith, or let's say axiomatically, that there is rationality in the Sharia. That's what makes qiyas possible. That's what makes analogical reasoning possible. There's also this thing of default permissibility, that if we're out of the realm of ritual acts of worship, your 5 pillars, your salah, and your siyam, and your zakat, and your hajj, then the default, according to the vast majority of scholars, is that something is permissible unless there is explicit evidence to prove that is impermissible. That sets up a really interesting ecosystem in which there's actually a tremendous potential for innovation and change. Sorry, Salafis, innovation, and the good type of innovation. We're not talking about blameworthy innovations here. So, we also have analogs and examples of the companions especially exercising this type of reasoning and instituting changes themselves in the early period of the Khulafa al-Rashidin, of the early righteously guided caliphs. There are situations where rulings are changed based off of changing circumstances that a more literalist interpretation would have a lot of issues with, because it seems like somebody is ruling against what the Prophet ﷺ ruled against, or what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ruled. But the reality is that the companions understood the rational basis of the Sharia, and they were simply fulfilling the substance of the rulings through other means, rather than ossifying and clinging to the form of the rulings and potentially negating its substance. The famous example is the example of lost camels. In the time of the Prophet ﷺ, if there were camels that were runaway camels, he was asked about it, ﷺ, and he said to leave them. And he said very explicitly to leave them be. Either the wolf is going to get it or the owner is going to find it, one of the two. When you get to the time of Uthman changed the government's attitude towards lost and found and towards lost camels. They actually had an active policy of gathering those camels and bringing them in, because the circumstances had changed. Medina was a thriving metropolis, banditry and theft was common, and rather than waste the wealth of the Muslims, there was at least an effort to collect it. Someone with a more superficial understanding of the Sharia would come and say, Uthman, what are you doing? You're changing a ruling that the Prophet ﷺ gave explicitly. But the companions understood the underlying rationality of the rulings in the Sharia, and they adapted them in order to fulfill the maqasid. I hate to use that term because it's overused and misinterpreted, but we could say, let's stick to English, the substance of those rulings and the intended objectives of those rulings, rather than merely the shell or the form. This was similar to Umar ibn al-Khattab. When he was the Khalifa, he prohibited the companions from resettling in the far-flung areas of the Muslim empire or Islamic empire, whatever you want to call it. Of course, that changed with Uthman, who permitted it, and then you see a different scenario. Maybe more applicable is Umar, his use of the diwan, which it's a very famous example, but a lesser known thing is that the diwan was also a way, or also served to pay diya, pay blood money. Okay, what's the diwan and how does this work? So if someone kills someone by accident, it's a manslaughter case. Normally, in the explicit rulings of the Sharia, that is borne by the aqila. The aqila is like your relative. So your group of relatives is responsible for paying blood money for that offense. But in Umar's time, when the Islamic empire had expanded, what you had was armies and garrison cities and people living far from their families. So if someone was guilty of manslaughter, it became very, very cumbersome and difficult to use that same technique or that same unit of social organization to fulfill that role. So Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhu used the diwan in order to satisfy it. So basically you had a register of people with similar occupations or similar occupations, and they would form a type of guild, I guess you could call it, or a unit. And that was something that took the place of the aqila in cases of diya where blood money had to be paid. Again, someone with a more superficial understanding of the Sharia would say, Umar, what are you doing? This is completely changing the ruling that the Prophet ﷺ gave us directly. But Umar ibn Khattab and the other companions, especially the rightly guided caliphs, they understood the underlying rationality of the Sharia, and that you want to satisfy the objectives of the Sharia and the substance of what the rulings are intended to achieve, rather than merely grasping onto the form. That's one. Two is maslahah, is the idea of common good or public good. And this is something, unfortunately, that has been abused in our times, similar to maqasid. But this is something that is very important. And you don't even need to go to maslahah mursala, which is a type of evidence that is disagreed upon by the classical ulama. There is something that is less controversial than that, called maslahah mu'tabara. That there are masalih, there are interests, there are objectives that are in the Sharia explicitly, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala names, and that the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam names. So for example, the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, he said, it's prohibited for two people to speak to the exclusion of a third. That means if us three guys are hanging out, and I take one aside and I whisper, that's not allowed, because I'm making the third person feel uncomfortable. And the Prophet ﷺ actually explicitly said, because that bothers the third one, or that makes him sad, or that affects his emotional state. So because we have that rational undergirding for that ruling, we know that is a maslahah mu'tabara. That is something that the Sharia is concerned about, or Allah is concerned about through His Sharia. That anything else that bothers or saddens or troubles your brother or your sister in Islam takes a similar ruling. And so then we can extend it to other things that might achieve the same goal. Okay? Now, this becomes important when we look at both things that we are doing and things that we are not doing. One of the things, let's take the proliferation of endowments, so the waqf or the awqaf system. This is something that was a maslahah mu'tabara. This was something, a recognized interest or public interest of the Muslims in order to have this waqf system. Now the waqf system was in place from the time of the Prophet ﷺ, and he encouraged to it, but it really exploded after the time of the Prophet ﷺ, to the point where almost everything that you can think that a modern government provides, a charitable endowment used to provide it at some point in Islamic history, whether it comes to hospitals or insane asylums or public drinking water or fountains or gardens or, the list goes on. And there's a famous story in Damascus of someone, bringing a dish of some food and dropping it and it breaks, and then someone tells them, hey, go to the waqf that replaces people's broken dishes, right? So they were really, really into this idea of proliferation of the endowment, that is a maslaha mu'tabara, that is something that is in the public interest of the Muslims, and therefore the extension of those things, and that's where it's relevant to the whole concept of Islamic governance and rule by the people, that is something that can be developed, or an avenue or vector that can be developed. The Ottoman millet system is another example. This is something that was based off of the dhimmi system, which is very normative in Islamic law, but it was an extension of that and a further institutionalization of that. Even when it comes to the production of knowledge in general and the generation of new disciplines within Islam, that is something that is not in the Quran or in the Sunnah. Nobody told anybody to invent usul al-fiqh. Nobody told anybody to invent the science of ilal or mustalah al-hadith. That the formation of these branches of knowledge, these disciplines of knowledge, they were something that was understood to be in the masalih of the Muslims, that this was a maslaha mu'tabara, that this was something that was in the service of the Muslims, and so that it was extended and extended and extended in new and interesting ways that served the goals of the Sharia. If you want to look at a very modern example, we could perhaps say prayer apps, right? You don't have to look at the sun anymore and measure your shadow and, oh geez, it's like, where is it? We're all lazy now. We all look at the clock and it's 8:42, and that's when, Islamic Finder says it's Fajr. Unless you're really nerding out on the 18 degrees versus the 16 degrees versus the 14 degrees, which is probably actually an interesting discussion in the UK, not as much in the US. But most people just open the app, right? And so that is something where it has benefited the Muslims, or at least it's an attempt. You can have taqweem, you can have an evaluation to see, well, did this really benefit the Muslims or not? But the idea is that these are the avenues and vectors through which you can actually achieve rule by the people, or people participating in Islamic governance in order to make life better. On the flip side, you also have the prevention of certain things, such as sadd al-dhari'a. This is known in fiqh as sadd al-dhari'a, or blocking the means. So if we look at one example, Umar ibn Khattab was very forward thinking, and when he conquered Palestine, he made it a waqf. And that was brilliant, because you can't give away a waqf. And so we see the ramifications of that and its responsibility, or its bearing upon us and our responsibilities today. You could also say that blocking the means comes up in zakat eligibility. We have a problem in the US, I don't know if you share the same problem, of everything under the sun being zakat eligible. My cat is zakat eligible, and my holidays are zakat eligible. And this is an abuse. And so we see that if zakat, by the statement of the Prophet ﷺ, is designed to be taken from the rich and given to the poor, and this main objective of the Sharia is not being met, even if the technical aspect of zakat, yes, technically we can make a way out, fi sabilillah, everything that is ta'lif al-qulub, things that are recognized as categories, we can hack them, right? This is the anti-hacking mechanism. We can hack them into making them work for us and what we want to do, but we have things such as sadd al-dhari'a, blocking the means, that will prevent that hacking from taking place, at least hopefully. One last thing, and this is not an exhaustive list, this is again just my preliminary thoughts, and I hope that you can contribute to this and problematize it and contradict everything I said, which is implied obligations and derivative obligations. This is encapsulated in the principle مَا لَا يُتِمُّ وَاجِبٌ إِلَّا بِهِ فَوَاجِبٌ, that if something is required in the deen, then anything else that is essential to that requirement being fulfilled also becomes required. The very simple, basic example that's always given is prayer and wudu. You have to have wudu in order to fulfill your obligation to pray. Therefore, even if we had no ayah in the Quran telling us to make wudu, wudu would be required, because we need it to fulfill this other thing. Well, let's scale that up and think about all the other things that Allah requires us to do. Allah requires us to establish justice. Allah requires us to have a certain amount of wealth redistribution through zakat and other means. So what are all of the furud kifaya, the communal obligations that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala requires us to do, and what are all the things that are underneath of them that could facilitate or might be even essential to the fulfillment of those obligations? That is a huge area that needs to be explored. And this is where we get into examples similar to like the diwan and how it functioned at the time of Umar ibn Khattab, that we have to pay the diya, you have to pay the blood money. What do you do to pay the blood money if the aqilah is no longer even functional? We have to find another way. So, I think we'll wrap it up here and we'll open it up to questions. And I know that there's some, mashallah, accomplished people in the room, and I'd really like your feedback here and your thoughts. That achieving good governance, which is, I think, the ultimate goal, achieving good governance, it requires a certain amount of innovation, a certain amount of flexibility, and a certain recourse to change. And my hot take is that the Sharia and Islamic governance, and even historical, early in the formative period examples of Islamic governance, seem to have a lot more built-in flexibility, built-in dynamism, built-in localism when it comes to everything that we've discussed, culture production, knowledge production. That seems to me to satisfy the idea of rule by the people in a better, more robust way, in a more substantive way, than what our modern democracies have come to. Now, there is a caveat here that we don't necessarily believe in the literal rule by the people, but we do believe in rule by Allah and rule by the believers. So maybe we can call it a mu'minocracy or something like that. I don't know, we can coin a different term. The point is that we can't lose the forest through the trees. Rather than get hung up on, and this is actually a qaida fiqhiyya, that we don't get hung up on what things are called. We try to ascertain what things are actually the reality of them, right? And so if I had this cup and I gave it to you and I said, hey, drink this, that this is khamr, this is alcohol, that's still permissible for you because there's coffee in here, there's not alcohol. It doesn't matter what I call it. So we can call something a democracy and it might not actually satisfy rule by the people, and vice versa. We can call something, or something could be Islamic governance or good governance, and it might also satisfy rule by the people, or at least by degree, if not entirely. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. So perhaps let's go to questions, inquiries, comments, concerns. You're going to set it up? You know, the first thing I saw was this pink bunny on the Duracell pack. And I thought, was Energizer like the first victim of Trump's tariffs? Because I see the pink bunny and I thought it's supposed to be Energizer, but I guess Duracell has a pink bunny as well.
It's a bit late, but she hung around the board.
Oh, okay.
Three non-functional mics. Try and open it up to in-person questions.
Any questions from the floor? Comments? Yes. Walaikum salam.
So my question kind of is with regards to Islamic democracy again. How exactly do you go about including minority groups? So, those that aren't always represented.
Absolutely. Fantastic. It's a great question. And Halak was asked if he would prefer to be a religious minority in a secular democracy or a religious minority under the Sharia. And he said the latter. He would rather be a religious minority under the Sharia. And I agree with him. I think that he's right on that. I think that the way in which the Sharia accommodates difference is much more structural and robust than the way in which modern democracies tolerate difference or claim to tolerate difference. That we see a simultaneous and a schizophrenic tolerance of cultural forms, of hijabs and foods and skin colors, while we see the active undermining and even ideological warfare against the values. So they are willing to give a certain representation of again, skin colors and cultural forms, but the representation and diversity of values is an entirely different thing. And I mean, I don't know. I mean, I have some preliminary ideas around genocide and the ideas of genocide and how genocide happens. And my hunch, and the historians in the room could correct me, but my hunch is that at least structurally, ideologically, genocide seems to be very much, or at least aggravated by, a homogenization that seems to come along with liberalism and the nation state, especially the ethno-nation state. How is it that and again, if there's Ottoman historians and I'm wrong, correct me, that the Ottoman Empire with its millet system could be sailing Jews from Spain and rescuing other people as they're turned out with pogroms, and then upon the eve of the Turkish state, they're committing genocides against Armenians and Georgians and Assyrians and Kurds, right? Like, to me, that seems like a very ideological shift. And I could be completely wrong about that. But my take is that there is a lot of hot air about tolerance in the modern era, but it is very superficial. Whereas the accommodation and even just look at legal pluralism. The Sharia is a legally pluralistic system. I mean, it allows for a certain degree of self-rule and autonomy, and even ecclesiastical autonomy. It's not going to interfere in who you declare your bishop or your rabbi to be. That's different than the nation state. Right? The nation state seems to care a lot much more about control and, again, homogenization and managing. But that's a larger topic, but that's, I guess, in general, my take on that. I think that's a good question.
Also, for anyone who wants to ask a question by the anonymous form, please use it now so that I can use my laptop to show and answer the questions.
Way in the back. Yep, you, sir.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thank you very much. The I would like to know what is your view on contemporary governments which usually try to legitimize their groups through a claim of being what they understand as being Islamic, whereas I would say in reality, as you said, like the Sharia obviously is shaped by things like pluralism or also the degree of ambiguity, but what we nowadays see is much more like a modern nation state which tries to centralize Islam like any other nation state. So what's your view on that?
No, that's a great question as well. If I understand your question correctly, because the distance was a little bit, that is also very relevant to Halak's argument. So his argument also delegitimizes many of those states that are claimants to Islamic governance. That if there is a fundamental incompatibility between the nation state and Islamic governance, then you really kind of only have one or the other. And the vast majority of the time, it is the nation state. A very classic example would be Saudi Arabia, right? Where Saudi Arabia established itself with legitimizing discourse that was very religious, based off of Wahhabism or whatever you want to call that movement. And MBS completely turned on it, right? And dumped everybody, really, except for a few madakhila here and there. And to me, that's just a secular state the whole way. It's just that the secular state needs a legitimizing discourse. And this goes back to Talal Asad, whose perhaps main thesis in Formations of the Secular is that secularism is not what it says it is, which is a simple separation of church and state or religion from society. It is rather the production of a new type of religiosity and a new type of religion which is amenable towards governance in the secular nation state. Right? And so what we find is that the MBS-like manipulation of Islam in Saudi Arabia is perfectly in line with secular governance. That's actually what secularism does to religion, that it cuts the cloth in the form that it wants and it uses it for obey the ruler even if, whatever, he whips you and puts you in jail and et cetera, right? That's like extremely, to me at least. So my general take is that my default assumption is that they're not Islamic, the vast majority of these. But then there could be a gradient, and it's probably a case-by-case basis. But we haven't, that's one of the significance to halak's contribution, is that it gets us to ask those questions, that we see now a fundamental incompatibility, and now we have to reckon with these states who claim Islam, but they perhaps are not really representing it, perhaps they're simply using it. You know. I'll try to balance girls and guys, men and women, unless there's nothing from the women. I know it's very American of me, apologize. I was told, they make you feel like a liberal when you come to the UK. Yeah. Okay, let's stick with the far back. Yes, gentleman in the hat. Way back, last row. Yes. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I was very interested in firstly, thank you so much for your whole presentation. I found it very enlightening. I was interested in your last comment where you mentioned a gradient. And I wondered if you saw nation states themselves in a gradient, because you spoke about them today. Of course, due to the nature of the presentation in quite essential terms, but the experience of a nation state for somebody living in London is not the same experience of a nation state somebody living in Kabul today, or a village in Bangladesh where the state is largely absent from their day-to-day life. It might not even be apparent to them that there's a new government today in a village somewhere in Bangladesh, to give an
Absolutely.
experience. So just to query whether you think there is a gradient and if the nation state essentially is so incompatible, because leading to part two of my question, your contributions are so fascinating, but I don't understand an applicability outside dismantling of the nation state. I don't know what else it could be or what that might look like. Thank you.
I got you, Habibi. Okay, so that's great. I agree. But I think they both can be true. I don't see necessarily a mutual exclusion between those two things, that the nation state could be fundamentally contradictory towards Islamic governance, and nation states might be on a gradient where their territoriality is mythical, right? And even halak says this, right? He says that the nation states par excellence are the US, the UK, the Western democracies, whereas you go even a place like Saudi Arabia, they don't have 100% control over their territory. They rely on tribal allegiances and rivalries that have existed for long before the nation state. And so they do not exert the same amount of penetration and control as the theoretical, maximalist, accomplished, full-form Super Saiyan nation state, right? So that's fair. I think that's entirely fair. And that's interesting because it provides possibilities. So if you look at how historical change happens, we need to talk about how historical change happens. And in those margins, right, outside of the centers where power is not as concentrated and the state penetrates less and has less control, especially over knowledge production and education, then that opens up a lot of possibilities, a lot of interesting possibilities. Sometimes those possibilities are thwarted by other systems that are in place, whether it's tribal organizations or not, or sometimes they're facilitated and helped by them. Now, that is a great segue into the second part of the question, which is, what do we build? And that's why I'm so excited, because there's so much that we could build. And actually, even in places such as the UK and the US, where we have the freedom to have religious endowments and make our own schools, right? That is a counterweight to the penetration and the monopoly of the state, or that the state tries to exert on, say, on education. Compare that, let's say, again, put it on a gradient, to Sweden, where it's illegal to homeschool. And if you take your children out of the schools, then they will come and take your children from you, right? That's sort of like a maximalist all the way in. We don't have that in the US or the UK, especially in the US. We still have a active, frontier mentality, anti-government sort of thing, where we have guns, lots of them. And we educate our own children. A lot of people homeschool. So there are cracks and opportunities, and there are spaces where things can happen. Now, if there are spaces where things can happen, that's where you this mishmash of preliminary thoughts, you can be like, well, what can we build institutionally? Like, there's no excuse why every mosque in the UK and the US shouldn't be funded by a waqf. There's literally no excuse, other than we haven't done it. Like, no one's stopping us. We have the funds. I do believe we have the funds. And that would open up other possibilities where now we can make waqf-based social services, free health clinics. We can do charity work based off of the waqf. We can do a lot, and we haven't done it yet. And if you look into, okay, bear with me here, if you look into the history of Zionism and how the Zionists moved in Palestine from especially like the 1880s all the way up until 1948, that's essentially what they did. They built everything, all the institutions, all the services, everything, and then they were ready for the moment when the British dissolved the Mandate of Palestine. Like hours after, they announced their state and etc. Obviously, we don't want to be criminals, but the idea of building institutions in the spaces where you have the freedom to build institutions, building capacity, building autonomy in the places where you have already the possibility to do that and no one's stopping you, I see that as like the major thing that Muslims in the West especially should be doing. As either just a hedge against whatever might come next. I mean, people talk about, at least in the United States, where Senor Trump is the lead, we talk about, is the government going to fall, or is it going to be a dictatorship, or what's going to happen, right? We have to have institutions, and we have to have some sort of capacity. So that's kind of my thoughts on that. Does that answer your question at least somewhat?
It does, but I don't see the mosque waqf being expanded so different to local government in the UK, where you have local representatives and you can do quite a lot with local government in the UK, as we've seen in some boroughs in the UK.
Yes, and I actually agree with that too. So I took part in our equivalent of the Muslim vote campaign, the Abandon Biden, Abandon Harris campaign, and all this sort of thing. So I'm not implying that just because there's an incompatibility, that means that it's hands-off haram. No, not at all. Actually, I think that it's important to participate, but knowing what we're doing when we're participating, right? Knowing that we're not necessarily building Islamic governance by the Muslim vote campaign, right? But that's a maslaha, right? It's instrumentalized, that this is a thing that it will affect Muslims and their quality of life and their ability to move at home and abroad. And so we actually have a duty, and that was one of the things. A lot of the HT people came after me, Hizb ut-Tahrir guys, when I was telling people to participate in the electoral system. They're like, very categorical, sweeping critiques. And my simple question was, if you had an opportunity to attach a political cost to genocide, would you do it? Are you morally obliged to do it? The answer is yes. Like, I don't understand a universe in which the answer is no. Like honestly, I don't think I'm propping up the state or I'm contributing. And that actually relies on some assumptions about participation. Does participation inherently mean the legitimizing and perpetuating of a system? That's not true. You can ruin something by participating in it. Anybody with kids knows that, right? So again, like, my interest is in trying to scramble categories, have people think about these things in maybe some more creative, less sweeping black and white terms, and just to look for the opportunities for how to move and where to build. And sometimes, things are sequential and there's 10 steps or 20 steps or 30 steps that could be taken, but we can only see the first 5. Like, we can't let the fact that we can't see all the way to the end dictate that we can't take the first 5. We can take the first 5 steps. And so that's at least my attitude towards it. Very engaging question, I appreciate that. Yes.
I'm a STEM major, so I might be completely out of touch with this whole subject. But what's to stop the nation state, like, you talk about how, like, one of the underlying objectives is to exert control, almost using forms of democracy, but then the substance doesn't actually come into fruition for people. So what's to stop them, once you've taken these 5 steps, or in the process of taking 3 steps, what's to stop them just exerting that control and changing the form? And then how do you combat that? Because are you just in this cycle?
It's a great question. Yeah, I mean, that's what we're trying to, I don't think that there's like a guarantee that can't happen, but I think that through building institutions and noticing the structural differences where something is likely to get co-opted versus where I'll give you an example. Like, let's talk, like, why don't I have a crazy idea for mosques. Like, because in the US we have this problem, and maybe you have this problem as well here, where the biggest donors get to call the shots. Yeah? Okay, good. Now, do they have any religious qualifications? No, they don't. And so should they be calling the shots about evaluating the imam and hiring? No, they shouldn't. So what if there was a double-blind donation process where you just dropped your donation in a black box and nobody knew who donated and nobody knew how much donated? And then you actually, like, that would be, I don't know, I'm excited about that. I think that would be an improvement to the way that mosques are run. And that is actually a mechanism that could prevent, or at least by degree, prevent the likelihood of some sort of takeover or co-optation or something like that. So that's the level of thinking that I want us to approach things from. Like, how do we, you can't guarantee that something can't be taken over and used or undermined or subverted, but you can try your damnedest. And I think that we need to really think like all the way through to try to do that. And I think that actually the things that we find in the Sharia give us at least a head start on how to do that. Whereas in Western democracies, we're just taught vote. And it's like, and that seems almost like an intentionally cynical thing to push on the people, where you don't really want them holding government accountable at the local or the federal level, where you just really want them to believe that they are holding people accountable through this pageantry of voting. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Yep. Walaikum salam wa rahmatullah.
So, historically speaking, we have seen that while Muslim nations used to have wealth, when the nation state or colonial projects of them came around, they got either nationalized or like put on the black market, etc.
Yes.
So, could we conceive in a certain way of the wealth itself being able to, of course, hypothetically, being to protect itself from the encroachments of the states as they are currently? And as a second part of that, especially as we've seen in the current election in the US, corporate power has been able to, even historically, corporate power has been able to take over the governments and use it for its own interest. So, and given that Halak does, I don't know if it was Asad or Halak was comparing the LLC versus the wealth. How can the wealth, as something that is beneficial to the community, be able to preserve itself against both corporate interests and state interests?
That's a great point. Yeah, I mean, eminent domain is always there. That's at least what we call it in the US. So the government can take anything from you anytime it wants. That's the long and short of it. And that's one of the vulnerabilities of life in any government, or especially if there's sort of a will to power that is baked into, especially the nation state, that they don't need a reason. They'll find a reason. They can take it away. However, again, if there's 40% freedom to move, then you take the 40%, right? And so you can build up something. It's still legal here, as opposed to try to go make a waqf in Saudi Arabia. Ain't going to happen, right? You're not going to. You can't even own property over there. Though that might be changing soon. But usually, when I was there, you had to have 51% ownership in a Saudi, right? So the ability is much more here, and you try to build things and insulate them from these takeovers as best you can, knowing that there's never going to be a fail-safe, but also knowing that the fact that there's never going to be a complete guarantee doesn't prevent you from doing what you can. Okay? And even, and that's where the believer is different from the kafir, because believers believe in Allah's will. And despite all of the odds against you, like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can make it happen, even in a situation that would otherwise seem extremely unlikely that it would succeed. And we even see examples like that in the US, like corporate interests are very strong, but there are times where corporations lose out, right? Or their interests change, and they change due to pressure. I mean, look at all the boycotts and everything that's happened through there. They're not moral, they're not changing because of their own, good hearts, they're changing because they know where the money's at. And so sometimes you can, in a Machiavellian sense, use people's own modes of action and logics of action against them, right? And this is the argument for why people were more pleased with the Trump presidency than a Democratic presidency, because at least Trump is just a hedonist. Anything that's going to make him feel like that he's the best thing ever, you might be able to get him to do. Whereas the Democratic Party they're ideologically committed to the occupation of Palestine. But Allah knows best on that. But you get to the point.
Yeah, I was more so wondering if the waqf within itself had the capability of, let's say, for example, advocacy group for itself, or maybe this might be a bit more extreme, but militia that only preserves the waqf from state encroachment.
You said it, not me. Front of the floor, yes, in the hat.
Okay.
Outside and then inside. Aisle seat. Oh, man, he's going to take it from you.
The first thing I wanted to bring out, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I don't think there was a shift from the Ottoman to Turkish rule. I believe there was signs during the Ottoman rule while they were committing massacres while they occupied the Balkans and they were profiteering from slave trade in Sudan. I think this is because they tried to imitate the West and the Western. I think nation states are a Western concept or a European concept. And I mean, you can see this through the popularity of nation states leading to Zionism and the formation of Zionism, and this pursuit of nation states in these ex-colonial bodies leading to failed states and issues such as what's happening in Sudan, in Libya, Somalia, etc. So I believe that it's not possible to achieve success without the Western failures and European failures using nation states. What's your opinions on this?
Totally fair and accurate about the Ottomans. That's actually one of Halak's points, is that the Ottomans essentially colonized themselves. And that's kind of a hot take, but he says basically that the 19th century, the Tanzimat reforms, was essentially the nationalization of the Ottoman project. Not that some of those things didn't extend before that period, which they did, but in general. So the question, just so I understand it, the end of it is, are we dependent upon Western states in order to, sorry, could you just like rephrase or repeat the last part?
Yeah, so my question was, my question is, this is more of my belief. I don't think it's possible using a nation state system to have a successful Sharia compliant body.
Yeah.
What's your opinion on this? Sharing thoughts on that.
Yeah, so you're with Halak, and I'm generally with him too. I mean, I'm very skeptical. Open question is, what degree of gradualism or halfways are there? Like, a lot of people are interested in what's going on in Syria right now. Like, how has that changed the dynamic? You've got sort of this tightrope they're trying to walk, where they're trying to not provoke Western military intervention, but they're also trying to portray themselves in a certain way and even do things, we'll see, time will tell for that particular model. But yeah, I mean, I'm with you. I think I'm with you in general. I believe in trying to imagine a world after the nation state. I don't think that the nation state is going to be an eternal technology or political configuration that's going to last forever until the day of judgment. I think that there's going to be something else. I think that even if we look at history, there was a time where it was pre-nation state and then it shifted to the nation state, and there were winners and losers in that transition. And so we have an interest in not just being the objects of history to which something happens and then we're left scrambling and reacting, but we have an interest in trying to think through and think out of the nation state and beyond the nation state for something else. And certainly in the last 15 months, we've seen the entire international order come into question. So who knows what's going to happen, right? Kama qala Lenin, right? Lenin said that there are years in which decades happen. Like, things might change in the next 15 years that might set the stage for how history is experienced for the next 500 years. Like, that's very possible. So we at least need a skin in that game. We at least need to be, and groups like Umatics do this work, where they try to think past and think beyond and think about various different models for how things could happen. And then, I don't know, we'll see what happens. Yes, thank you. The brother next to you, because, sorry, Mike, sit down.
So, to what extent do you think that these possible Islamic governments' alternatives to the nation state are possible in the context of a global economic system based on riba?
That's a great question.
In that, and if they're not possible, then at that point, alongside coming up with Islamic government alternatives to the nation state, how do we think about Islamic economic alternatives to the current system of global capitalism?
That is a fantastic question, man. Allah bless you. I agree. I don't think it's possible. Long story short. Especially, like, I would separate two things there. There's the international finance system and the IMF and the World Bank and the predatory loans and the soft power. Like, that certainly we've seen in very obvious ways in which how that has been designed to, trap up-and-coming movements or anything else. But even beyond that, global capitalism in general, its riba-based nature, I 100% agree. I'm not an economist, so I try to, stay in my lane, so I'm not going to speak too much on that. But again, Umatics is a group that is doing good work on that front as well, because it needs to be. We just released, I think, a video on Yaqeen Institute's YouTube channel about No Buy 2025 and the importance of localism and actually the critique that is in Islam of capitalism. There are very, very trenchant critiques of capitalism that are inherent to Islam that we don't always bring to the fore. Sometimes it gets lost out in the commercialization of the deen or the celebrity dawah culture or all of these, the social media buzz and all of these things, which I find personally very detestable. But that's another presentation. So thank you. Yeah. Anyone from the ladies? Yes. That was you. Yes.
I was wondering, obviously we're talking about the potential death of capitalism, which is unlikely to happen in nation states, as being perhaps the best way to carry out more of a Sharia compliant and Islamic compliant sort of way of living. If we're talking about the current context, and you're talking about how democracy can be approached in sort of a non-ideological way, and taking it on as sort of a duty for the Muslim community, I was wondering how far as Muslims do we then take on other kind of non-ideological social movements, for example, like you say, like socialist principles, or I don't know, for example, feminism is a social movement. How far can we take these on? And I think in the current Islamic context, it's a very binary, feminists are so bad, they're ruining Islam, etc., or you do socialism, Allah, it's awful. But I think it's very hard to consider kind of a way in which we can kind of approach a more Sharia-like state without social movements within the current political social context. So.
That's a great question, Mel. Bless you. Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that 100%. I mean, I sort of take it axiomatically that all right, let me back up. I think that as a conceptual category, we need to develop a theory of harakah, that we need to develop a theory of movement. And I've got a couple, sinister plans for why this has to happen. One is that we need a mechanism to lower the stakes in intersectarian theological debates. Right now, if the Deobandis are arguing against the Salafis, or the Salafis are arguing against the Ash'aris, then it is haqq and batil, right? It is either Islam, capital I, or it is false. We need a way to take the teeth, or just drop the temperature on that debate a little bit, to the point of recognizing, I think one of the ways to do it is to introduce the idea of the harakah, that these are harakat, movements, are not just social and political, but they're also theological as well, right? And so Salafism is a harakah. It is a theological and political movement. And once you bump it down, the Deoband tradition as well, it does not predate the reaction to British colonialism. So once you move it into that register of harakah, of a movement, then you can actually have an evaluation. You can have taqweem. And then you can recognize the positives and the negatives. Then you can realize the legitimate grievances that it had, and perhaps even the overreactions or missing the mark, right? And I think that overall thing is essential to how we talk about what you are mentioning, that, do we think that socialism is 100% wrong on everything? Obviously it can't be. Do we think that feminism is 100% wrong on everything? No way, it can't be, right? So we have to do the same thing that we did, I believe, with democracy, and disentangle and disaggregate. That feminism, to take one example, aggregates a whole bunch of things, some of which we would agree with, and most of which probably we wouldn't, such as liberal autonomy and the sense of individualism and the materialism. Feminist theory is very much indebted to Marxism and historical materialism, right? We wouldn't accept that. However, has there been misogyny? Yeah, absolutely. Have women's rights been trampled upon? Absolutely, right? Have they been oppressed historically? Absolutely. So we have to find a way to disentangle and disaggregate those things, and then to be able to respond in a nuanced and targeted way that's not going to commit the same sort of ping-ponging back and forth between wild extremes, where we're either pandering to feminism or we're red-pilling, right? It's that's not a healthy oscillation for anybody. I mean, I believe in, a transcendence, and I would hope that disaggregation would try to transcend that opposition and recognize the valid critique. Because even Red Pill has valid critique to it. I mean, there is a war against men and boys and masculinity, just as much, at least as there's a war against women and girls. So yes, the ideological space is a very dangerous space, and we need to figure out mechanisms and ways to talk about these things and actually resolve them and push the thinking forward and push the actions forward without falling prey to just the ideological register. So, thank you. Yes, sir, glasses.
I'm an engineer, and I've always been very interested in technologies and how they shape things. So I was told I have seen how sort of the Russian influence on the internet, so the internet basically. I've also seen how the Chinese have been able to use technology that
Can you hold the microphone just a little bit closer? Yeah.
I've also seen how the Chinese have been able to use technology that was adjacent and eventually sort of coming plus technology. I see that in Africa, the mass adoption of Bitcoin, cryptocurrencies, has basically provided some level of power against the economic order. My issue is how can you essentially leverage the amount of technology to how to do without any sort of value in it because unfortunately most of what I see is simply out, but not any sort of technology that people can use and that can be basically a very powerful phone tower because if we were social media that was good enough or economic cryptocurrency that was even good enough, you would have seen that. But on the other hand, I have seen very strong opposition from the standard Islamic discourse against these technologies.
Yes.
I lived in Egypt for a time where even engaging with the internet was considered haram. So this is my issue. How do we still be able to embrace technology and even invent technology? Because we do have the capacity, but there is sadly this barrier that is prevented because of the wanting to also still fit within the Sharia.
Yes. You guys are awesome. These are all amazing questions. You guys are really fantastic. That's a very good point. Halak has a very interesting thing that he says about what's the relationship between technical or technological invention and history. And he critiques the way in which it's usually told, in which technology or changes in technology simply have an effect on the history that comes after. He puts forward the opposite, that it's actually the episteme and the worldview that produces the technological innovations, because all of those technological innovations have an underlying organizational metaphysics, right? And so it's no accident that we invented the atomic bomb. It's not simply an unfolding of history. It's actually once the proper or suitable worldview came about, then that logic and that society was optimized for violence. And therefore, those are the types of innovations and technological advances it pursues. Right? So Halak's a little bit controversial with that, in that he even says that it's not that we couldn't have invented it sooner. We could have, technically speaking. People could have figured out what was the difference is that people would never have wanted to figure that out, because it was in a different time with a different episteme and a different worldview. Okay? And there's other examples that are very telling. The atomic bomb is a very dramatic one. Napalm is another, all these technologies of war are very, very dramatic. Okay, so where does that leave us on what you're saying? That's where we need to attend to what is the organizing logic and metaphysics from which we are producing new technologies. If it is simply the metaphysics and the worldview of the Western secular world, we're going to get more of the same. We're going to get more commodification, we're going to get more fracturing, we're going to get everything that's sort of wrong with late capitalism, we're going to see more and more and more of it. If we were able to inculcate an episteme within our communities, or even regionally in certain parts of the Muslim world, where it's based off of the organizational logic of taqwa, of piety, of service, of etc., we could find out some really interesting things. We could take the food system, for example. This is I used to farm, actually. I spent some time farming organic vegetables for a couple years before I went to Medina. The food system, after it was industrialized, the varieties of food that are grown are optimized for what is able to be shipped the most easily and endure shipping and sit on the shelf for the longest amount of time. It's not optimized for health. It's not optimized for nutrition. It's not optimized for even taste or flavor. And so this is something that some scientists have referred to as nutrient collapse, where actually the foods that we eat are getting less and less nutritious, because for generations now, farmers have been choosing the least and least nutritious varieties. So that's a demonstration of what happens when your underlying organizational logic is something, X, and then it produces results downstream. So if we had a different underlying organizational logic, whether it's taqwa or whether it is, service to the people, or whether it's the most efficient distribution of public goods, or whatever it is, I think that is almost the place to start that would develop or result in some really interesting consequences for what could be invented, right? And that's just my political science mind. I'm not an engineer, so I can't take you any further than that. Yes, sir.
It seems like a lot of the problems, a lot of the obstacles for comprehensive Islamic governments are institutionalized in the liberal international order, both militarily in terms of just the sheer power that Western states have, but also ideologically in terms of how embedded nationalism is in Muslim communities. That being said, Muslim countries are largely inept. They can't fight against this. We have the power to vote in the West. Should Muslims actively support destabilizing forces like the Front, Farage, Le Pen, in order to almost sabotage and create something better out of instability? Because I feel like this is genuinely a struggle I've had, especially in the 2024 election. You have your choice of stability and maybe oppression light, or you have instability, maybe less oppression, or maybe the worst thing ever.
Yeah. So. That's a great question. You're not the first person to ask me that question about accelerationism. I agree that a comfortable but violent status quo sometimes has to be destabilized by a short period of more acute harm in order to achieve an objective down the road. I think that is true. And I think that the last 15 months have showed us that. Even in the West, I think that our support for Palestinian liberation has shown us that there almost seemed to be a trade-off between the safety of our own institutions and our own selves and our own lives, and the ability to move things forward for Palestine. And we're still seeing that, to be honest. So in general, I can see that, and that might be true. How often it's true and in every situation, I'm not sure. Already within the last 15 months, a lot of those things that you referenced that were not even contested before are now severely contested now. The international system of law is completely in shambles. The credibility is shot. A lot of things are in play now, and a lot of things are the least stable that they've been for a long time. So that provides opportunities. And that gets back to the point we were talking about preparing for those opportunities and trying to build, however we can, wherever we can, the capacity to exploit those opportunities when they come, because we don't know when the next time such opportunities are going to come our way. So maybe yes, definitely sometimes. I'm not sure about all the time. No. Yes.
You mentioned instability in the international system. Do you think that can give rise to a bigger appetite to the political expression of a more Puritan, authoritarian, not authoritarian, but more Puritan form of Islam that is more genuine to that kind of Wahhabi sense of Islam? For example, what we see in Syria, what we see in Afghanistan. Do you think that has more chances of being palatable to the West, especially dialogue with these states?
I don't think palatability is the question. I think that especially with Syria, one of the things that we learned was where's the political will to intervene, right? So the West lost the political will to intervene, and that created an opening for something else to happen, right? The U.S. wasn't willing to get involved, Russia wasn't willing to get involved, and that created an opening. So yes, I mean, you can see things of that nature, in short. Yes?
Your comparison relies on looking at the sort of essence of democracy rather than its sort of formal structures, which I completely get.
Thinking about the sort of the structures that we have now in terms of representative democracy, when we think about Muslims who are in representative spaces, do you think that it's basically a dead end, or where is the sort of generative innovation in that? Where can that sort of be? Where can that go, or is it sort of a futile enterprise?
That's a great question. It is related to the earlier question about using the system, or to what extent is that a front in our objectives as a community. I don't see it as a dead end inherently, though I do question the way in which we have moved in it and understood it up until now. That we have tended to be satisfied with that same sort of tokenization and formal representation in exchange or despite any representation of our values or actual community power. So I think that the answer is yes, there's a lot that actually can be done in those spaces, but we have to start to act in accordance to our values and pushing our values forward, and be a little bit wiser to the fact that formal representation, I don't want to say it doesn't matter entirely, but it certainly matters way less than we think it does. That in fact, if you go back to the colonial history, they've always used one of us against us. Or as Malcolm said, they will hire one of us to kill one of us just to say it was one of us. And even you have that in the Quran. Qarun in Surah Al-Qasas was the first cousin of Musa. He was Bani Israel. So he was the gatekeeper, and he was the one cracking the whip over Bani Israel. So until we develop that maturity where we are able to, let's say, support somebody who's not a Muslim, who actually advances our values, over somebody who is actually a Muslim, who doesn't, like that would be a major milestone, I think, in that type of maturity. But I think there's room to act. I think that there's things to be had. You follow up?
Maybe just to follow
Sure.
up. Where do you think our representation kind of lies outside of those sort of forms? Would it be like a more community or
Yeah.
the way outside of sort of like?
Right. No, that's a great question. I mean, all of the sectors of society that, whether it's economic power, I think that, well, I'll give you an example. In the United States, the dollar, they measure how long a dollar stays in a certain community. Okay? The dollar that stays in one particular community the longest is the Chinese dollar. Now, the Chinese has a community that if anybody has money, like they will actually like straight up go up in New York City with like a briefcase full of cash and buy buildings. They don't use banks. They have their own banks. Right? Like that is a highly organized community. Right? That is a community with a lot of power. So there's economic, there's providing social services and free things to society that, you become very valuable to a society and to the government if you are alleviating poverty and feeding people and sort of filling in the gaps that the government is not actually taking care of. Cultural production, look at Habib, look at how powerful Habib is, he makes all of Ireland is a fan of Habib, despite McGregor, right? Like, these are all different fronts in which you can develop capacity and power, and then opportunities come. Yeah. Thanks, Salamata.
So, one of the biggest advantages nation states have is, especially in the West, individualism. So every person stands before the state as alone, or even if it's more theoretical, because sometimes people do really agree. So, in order to strengthen oneself, how can an individualist society, or even like societies that are decaying towards individualism, could they reform familial ties, or even pseudo tribal bonds?
Yep. Absolutely. Yeah, individualism is a long-term vulnerability, as all of Europe is now facing with the depopulation and the birth rates and all of this. People want dogs instead of children. It offends the autonomous individual self to have even marriages, the ball and chain, right? All these ways in which it's represented in this sort of oppressive manner. It's the unchosen, forced norm that Lockean autonomy just absolutely abhors. So what papered over that, or the Band-Aid on top of that, was always immigration. Because as long as the US or the UK was just pumping in immigrants to take over the jobs and continue to have robust families, while the more long-term residents of that land would have smaller and smaller families, then the system kind of worked. But now that we're seeing the rise of the right and the rise of nationalism, then that's reversing that, and therein lies like a very open-ended question. As for how you can act or how you can move in a very individualist society that undermines those things, there's tons of opportunities, because it takes the foresight and the intentionality to do it. So, for example, just look at the way in which we don't think it any, like, how many of you are actually like from Cambridge? Wow, yeah. So there you go. So if your family lives in London, it's obvious, if you get into Cambridge, you go to Cambridge, right? What if the family moved with you? What if you stayed back to study, like you limited your opportunities to London? That's a very radical, anti-individualistic way to think. This is, every immigrant family knows this. Like when my family came to the US from Italy, there were 13 kids, my grandfather's generation, and they all had a different role to play. And the oldest one had certain responsibilities and bankrolled the education of the younger ones, and they all did different things. So, and most of us are close enough to our immigrating ancestors to remember that type of mentality. There's books about this called like the family corporation, where the entire extended family used to work as like one corporation, right? In Saudi, they actually still do this, where they will buy an apartment building, but the nuclear families will occupy the different units. So you've got an entire building owned by an extended family, but each unit has a nuclear family. So there's ways of doing it, but you have to be willing to actually, when push comes to shove, when that acceptance from Cambridge or Oxford comes in the mail, are you going to be able to say no, right?
In the interest of time, I think it might be better to...
Interest of time?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, I have a train, huh? In how long?
In 1 hour, 10 minutes.
1 hour, 10 minutes? Okay. Let me rapid fire roll through these questions that came in online, which is one of my favorite things to do. And then whatever time we have left, you just stop me, okay, when we absolutely have to leave. Okay. Controversial question. Sayyid Qutb's milestones is very present in the collective unconscious of the Arabic-speaking world, which led to the negative perception of Halak's book. How do you suggest that this can be remedied? Yeah, they just didn't understand Halak, honestly. But I think that, it's not all their fault. Halak's really hard to understand. And he really named his book something that was probably easily misunderstood. But I think that there's been a lot of work to try to explain it better. And I think that Halak's intervention does question the direction of the harakat, such as the Ikhwan, and where they're going. Whereas before Halak, there was an assumption that you just need to get the power of the nation state, and then you won. Halak's like, whoa, wait a second. No, actually, you need to think beyond that, because the nation state's going to eat you up every time. So I don't really know, I guess. How would Islamic governance intersection with the regulation of the internet and AI look like? I don't know. Sorry. I'm a dinosaur. I don't really get tech. In light of the pervasive fingers of the overreaching government and its impact on our schooling system, what are your thoughts on Muslims pursuing alternative modes of education, homeschool? Yes, that's a good idea. And the direction we ought to work towards as an ummah, considering our own amnesia in knowing ourselves and knowing our Lord. Malcolm X said, you would be a fool to turn over your children to your enemies to educate them. I think homeschool is a very important thing. I think building up the infrastructure of Islamic education, which is at a woeful state right now, is very important. And I'm sad that no one here does education. One, in regards to focus on the substance and not the form, we both, whoops, oh man, someone added a question and it just jumped on me. And not the form we both need the Islamic tradition as foundation and the outer world to interact with it, to see how that foundation takes substance. So how do we interact with our so-called secular theories to understand the world, especially if you're not a scholar? I don't really accept that bifurcation between secular and Islamic. I think that it's all Islamic. I think that, again, this is founded on what's your understanding of secularism. If secularism is a separation, then that question makes sense. But I don't believe that at all for a second. I believe that secularism is the generation of a new type of, and the production of a new type of religiosity that is amenable to liberalism and the nation state. So you can have your Islamic theories about how to understand the world, because everything's Islamic. Two, in Muslim countries in in West, any models, historical examples, theories on how to implement local governance and contextualizing, especially in Western secular country? Yeah, it happens all the time. There's all these different attempts. I think that the Nation of Islam in the US was an interesting experiment, okay? Say what you want about their Aqidah, which was wild, that they actually had a really interesting model of economic independence. They had international corporations that unfortunately they sold off when most of them became Sunni Muslims. And they had a model, and that model should be studied. But that's a larger problem. We need to gather up all these models for study and reflection, which we haven't really done yet. Is it possible to add a function to the waqfs to protect themselves from state? That was asked on the floor. Should Muslims support free speech if they're a minority in a Western democracy? Yes, I think so, in general. Though I would obviously stop short of particularly advocating for anything that would harm the Prophet ﷺ. I also don't believe in, let's say, the criminalization of some types of hate speech, because that's a slippery slope. Every sword you sharpen can cut you, right? So every vehicle you create legally, and this is a problem that we've faced as we've been minoritized and racialized, is that we have been tempted to use the powers of the state in order to sort of punish our enemies or insulate ourselves from certain things that Allah told us is going to happen, like adha, he said in Al Imran, right, that you're going to hear, وَلَا تُسْمَعُونَ, right, you're going to hear from the people of the book and from the people who are idolaters, adhan kathira, you're going to hear it. Do we want a maximalist understanding of hate speech where we criminalize any Islamophobic content or any Islamophobic comment? No, I don't think we do. I think that that's a vehicle that could too easily be used against us, and that we should probably find a different way. One more question. Oh no. Is there any substantial value in using the word democracy in Islamic governance discourse? We could also talk how Sharia fulfills the objectives of dictatorship, swift rule, security, but we don't do that. Well, yes, ideologically, there is a reason, because democracy is a golden calf right now. It's an idol. So you are doing something there when you do that. Like, nobody wants to defend dictatorship. Would it be more beneficial to focus on the benefits of Islamic governance to human beings rather than trying to associate it with a well-known and not working governance type? Well, the advantage of associating, well, I don't think we're associating with democracy. I think that we're problematizing what democracy is. Right now, the average person in the West doesn't realize that they don't have democracy. So by drilling into what makes a democracy and showing how it's not fulfilling its maqasid or its ultimate objectives is actually a really important thing to do. So what are our political aims in Western countries like the UK? That's too general, sorry. How can governance deal, whoa, another question got added again. How can governance deal with the differences of opinions amongst ulama? There should be definitions of what everyone agrees is wrong and what everyone agrees is right, and then here's where everybody stands in the middle. This question actually came yesterday in High Wycombe with the Karima Foundation on like art and media and the portrayal of certain things and images and etc. I think that one way forward that's slightly ecumenical is to have those delineations. In light of what happened in Syria, do you think that political expression of a more uncompromising Puritan, that was asked? What do we mean by Islamic governance? Islamic governance gives us certain principles, rules, values, but does not suggest a regime. Yeah, that's intentional, actually. All the institutional actors you have mentioned, like Mufti, Qadi, etc., have been formed by the previous states in accordance with their needs. Previous states before Islam? I don't understand. Do we need to refer to the same actors when talking of Islamic governance today? Yeah, I think they're essential, because we will not have Usman, alayhi salam, radiallahu anhu, or Ali, anhu, in 21st century to rule Allah's way. There'll be a big space for corruption. Yeah, I'm not sure if I mean, some things, listen, when the Sharia is explicit about something, it's for a reason, and when it's not, it's for a reason. Some things are left undetermined because they are to be figured out later or experimented with. Should Muslims welcome the instability? We asked that. How do we combat nationalism in our Muslim communities? We kind of asked that. Within the ideal Islamic government, how do you apply freedom of speech and allow for discourse with its rulers, something that is often a point of contention in modern day with yeah, that's very important. You need to have some sort of like, what did Ali radiallahu anhu Institute was called, like al-madhalim, right? You have to have a watchdog body that is able to actually watch the government. And so there needs to be a certain amount of free speech when it comes to rulers. I think so. Is there any hadith suggesting that Khilafah will return? I think so, can't remember. Should Muslims follow the Amish model? Yes. I have a lecture on that. in Canada I gave with the I3 Institute, not in the form, but in the substance, right? Which is that they make everything a moral decision, okay? That when they decide to take on a technology or not take on a technology, that they decide, does this adhere to our values? And they actually wait until the non-Amish society, which do you know what they call them? The English. Yeah, everyone who's not Amish, they call the English. So they wait to see the effects on the non-Amish society, and then they say, yes, we're okay with that, or no, we're not. Anyway, I think we're out of time. Barakallahu feekum. May Allah forgive me for any shortcomings. This is a fantastic engagement. I really appreciated everyone's bright and brilliant contributions. Forgive me for my shortcomings. Subhanakallahumma bihamdika ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilaik. Hopefully, I'll come back before too long. Assalamu alaikum.